Chapter 15. Eleanor's Last Adventure. The peace for which Eleanor had worked so hard came abruptly to an end in 1202. John's devious behavior undid it all when he underhandedly snatched away a bride-to-be from a prominent noble and married her himself. The noble complained to his overlord, King Philip, who summoned John to appear in court. When John refused, Philip declared all John's continental lands forfeit and renewed the war. Now the moment had come for Philip to make use of Eleanor's grandson Arthur. After knighting the young boy and filling him full of glories to come, he sent him swaggering south to take over the Plantagenet lands below the Loire River, while he himself invaded Normandy. When Eleanor heard that Arthur, with 200 of Philip's hand-picked knights, was at the Loire River only a few miles north of Fontrevolt, she reacted with alarm. Were they going to strike at her lands? Did Philip no longer honor her vassal's oath? Did they think she was too old to care? Perhaps they thought she was already dead. They were quite wrong. While there was still breath in her body, she would defend her lands. She somehow found energy to muster an escort and quickly took off for Poitiers, where she had plenty of loyal vassals to help defend her duchy. Eleanor, now over 80, could no longer travel at her usual speed, and she found the road already blocked by Arthur's knights before she got to Poitiers. She barely had time to detour to the castle of Mirabeau, where she and her own few knights shut themselves up in the central tower and lowered the portcullis. They were not completely secure. The walled town surrounding the castle was poorly protected, and there were few provisions to withstand a long siege. Eleanor immediately sent a messenger through the postern gate to her son John, 80 miles away. When Arthur and his knights discovered Eleanor's whereabouts, they realized that this was an opportunity not to be missed. The risks were little, the stakes were high. Their plan was to lay siege to the castle of Mirabeau, capture the queen, and hold her for high ransom. With such a hostage, they could force John to yield anything they wanted, even Aquitaine. Within 3 days, they had secured the town below the castle and walled up all the gates except one, which they left open for expected reinforcements. Then the insolent young Arthur began to bargain with his grandmother, offering her freedom in exchange for all her lands. From a tower window, Eleanor played for time, artfully stringing out conversations as long as she could, hoping that her message had reached John and that he was on his way to rescue her. That evening, as darkness was falling, Arthur and his knights conferred. Sure of their quarry, they decided to wait until morning to assault the tower and capture the queen. It was a balmy, starry July night, and the besiegers removed their armor. Most of them fell asleep in the town streets. As soon as John had gotten the news of his mother's plight, he had started to her rescue. Aided by the brightness of the stars and moon, he continued to ride at breakneck speed all through the night. He arrived at Mirabeau just before dawn. With swords drawn, he and his knights rushed in through the one open gate and fell upon the sleeping French. Those who tried to resist were slain, the others were captured, none escaped. Then John, with a lack of chivalry that would have horrified his brother Richard, subjected his captured nobles to the most humiliating disgrace, chaining them to ox carts and parading them through their own estates before depositing them in dungeons. His nephew Arthur, a traitor to the Plantagenets, was thrown into the thick-walled dungeon of Falaise near the English Channel. He was never seen again. Dark rumors later spread that John had murdered him. King Philip was beside himself with anger upon hearing that his best knights and Arthur, his instrument to destroy John, had been captured and were languishing in prison. The utter stupidity of it all, just to capture an old queen who would soon be dead. This was Eleanor's last and most unusual adventure. Who ever heard of an 80-year-old grandmother besieged by her own grandson? It had been a close call. Her presence of mind and John's unusually prompt action had saved her. It had been a great victory for John to capture Philip's best knights, but it was his one and only victory over the French. Once freed, Eleanor continued to Poitiers, but her favorite ancestral castle was small comfort to her. Her great hall, which had once swayed to lively dances and echoes to the songs of troubadours, was ghostly now. It had become what is called today the Hall of the Lost Footsteps. Worn out and sick, Eleanor retired once more to the Abbey of Fontrevolt, this time to the care of the nuns. Soon Eleanor lay dying, and her world seemed to be dying with her. The great empire she had helped to build was disintegrating rapidly. She had done her best to make John into a king, but she could not remake his unstable character, sometimes capable, more often weak and cruel. Without her guidance, John let power slip away to the dogged Philip, who was gaining inch by inch, fulfilling the prophecy that he would be a hammer to the English. But all that became remote to Eleanor when she slipped into a coma. She was probably spared the news that Richard's great rock castle, Chateau Galliard, fell to the French after a 6-month siege. That meant the loss of Normandy and Anjou, but most of Aquitaine would remain in Plantagenet hands for another 200 years, as though loyal to its former duchess. In Fontrevolt, the trees were growing green. Tiny buds of broom plant, Plantagenista, would soon be bursting into yellow blossoms. Spring had come when Eleanor died on April 1st in the year of 1204. She was 82 years old and had reigned for 67 years. First Queen of France, then Queen of England, she is most remembered as Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of the Troubadours. She was buried in the Abbey Church of Fontrevolt next to her beloved son Richard and Henry, whom she had once loved so passionately. You can see her effigy still. Her face with its fine features radiates an ageless beauty and intelligence, and there is a faint suggestion of a smile. She holds an open book in her delicate hands. No one knows whether it is a book of prayer or a book of songs. Amid the crashing of castles, as fortress after fortress was falling to the French, little attention was paid to the death of the great queen. But the nuns who knew her best in her last days wrote, "She enhanced the grandeur of her birth by the honesty of her life. She surpassed almost all the queens of the world." They might have said much more about this remarkable woman, whose life had spanned almost a century, outliving 2 husbands and all but 2 of her 10 children. From a frivolous, willful young girl who had matured into a wise, understanding woman and a great ruler. She lived life to the full, facing sorrows and dangers with amazing courage, whether suffering unspeakable hardships in the wild mountains en route to the Holy Land, storm-tossed on the high seas, riding over the wintry Alps at the age of 70, enduring 15 years of captivity, or daring to express her independence as a woman. Above all, she inspired poets to compose beautiful love lyrics and helped to launch a new romantic literature that we still enjoy today. Though the French would not forgive Eleanor for her marriage to the English King Henry and the loss of Aquitaine, they could not forget her. Her life provided material for balladeers and songsters. They depicted her as a siren, sorceress, or fairy queen who could change herself into a demon. They raked up all the unsavory gossip of her behavior, including, 2 centuries after Eleanor's death, the ridiculous story of the queen offering fair Rosamond a choice between poison or the dagger. Such was the stuff of ballads. But Eleanor had no need for fantasy or myth to keep her image alive. Her real life was extraordinary enough. Author's note: all accounts of Eleanor, whether from admirers or critics, speak of her extraordinary, radiant beauty, but none of them tells us exactly what she looked like. We know her eyes were fascinating, but we don't know what color they were. We don't know if she was a blonde or brunette. The ideal beauty of the 12th century was fair-haired and blue-eyed, as depicted in all the romances. If Eleanor was a model in looks as well as character for Guinevere and possibly Isolde, she would have been a blonde. Yet she was born in an area where most people were dark-haired and brown-eyed. I think of Eleanor as having dark, luxuriant hair, high color, and sparkling eyes, but I would not be able to say what color they were. But whatever Eleanor's type of beauty, she was, as one contemporary said, a woman beyond compare.